Hello, everyone. Welcome to this IDA Award Spotlight screening of FX's Pride, moderated by Travell Anderson. Really excited to get to this conversation today. Before we begin, I'm going to offer a brief land acknowledgement as we do here at the IDA. My name is Cassidy Diamond. I am the Associate Director of Public Programs and Events. I am coming to you today from Los Angeles, which is on the unceded land of the Tongva and Chumash people, who have been stewards of this land for generations. I would also like to thank our sponsor, Variety, who is helping to bring this series to you all today. And special thanks to our ASL interpreter, Andrea Lust, for helping us to make this Q&A as accessible as possible today. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Travell and we can get started with this conversation. Welcome, Travell.
Hello. Thanks so much for having me. So excited to be here for this wonderful conversation about Pride. I'm going to bring up our two guests, executive producers of Pride, Alex Stapleton and Christine Vachon. Welcome you two to this conversation. There we go. How are you, Christine and Alex?
Excellent.
Good, thank you.
So to get us started, let's do the basic, easy intro, which is how did this opportunity come to you all, and what in particular, why you felt like this was the right moment, the necessary moment to like delve into this history of the LGBTQ, rights movement.
I guess I'll start on that one, right, Alex? So, what seems like 1 million years ago now, Killer Films was approached by Refinery 29, and they were, they wanted to know if we'd be interested in working with them on a documentary about LGBTQ rights in America, and I think they were already thinking about sort of dividing it up by decade, the way we did finally in the show. And what I was really interested in, because Killer Films is not really known for documentaries, although we tend to get involved with quite a few. And I was interested in doing something that didn't feel like that cookie cutter, put the clips together, even though I love those. So my idea was, let's approach 6 different directors, and each one will take a decade and make it their own. And this was, a pretty, as I realized as we started to put it together, that was a very ambitious approach. And one of the things, I'd love Alex to talk about, because, one of the things that she did so beautifully was really figure out how to keep the sort of the integrity of the show overall, while still allowing these, actually 7 different directors, because there was one directing team, allowing these directors to really put themselves and their style into each show.
Alex?
Yeah, I mean, when I came onto the project, it was already kind of the groundwork was laid. And I would say about half of the directors were in place. And it was a real challenge, but it was the beauty of what the show did, which was telling an overarching story where it felt like a baton toss. There was a handing off, at the end of the episode for the next episode to pick up on. And we wanted to kind of keep certain themes alive in each episode. And I think we definitely pulled that off. And that, I think one of the main themes was recognizing that queer history is not, it's not cookie cutter. It's not a one size fits all type of history. And we wanted to really raise voices that we felt as a collective, you may not know. We wanted to kind of look at raising up the voices of folks that have been overlooked with even in the queer community. And so that was really important to all of us. And so it was the casting, if you will, of like who we were going to focus on per decade was a very big conversation that Christine, myself, and all of the filmmakers were really in tune with. So one, you know, the directors who were doing the 1970s or the 80s, for example, were very much aware of what was going on in the decades, you know, before them, so that we could kind of all feel connected.
One of the things that resonated with me, I've been slowly making my way through the series, is first and foremost how you all start before Stonewall. I feel like LGBTQ history for a lot of folks, it starts with the throwing of the brick and that's it. Could y'all talk to a little bit, maybe I'll start with you, Christine, on this one. Talk a little bit just about wanting to be as vast as possible in covering, you know, the progression of the movement.
I mean, I think it's really important, you know, that, I mean, you know, yes, you're right. A lot of people think, you know, queer history begins with Stonewall, but it's so important to know that there were other uprisings and really other uprisings that were in very marginalized communities and that just, you know, aren't really talked about, you know. And I think, you know, it was really one of the really gratifying things about the show is now when I, you know, go through Twitter to see what people are saying, for example, or other social media, is how many young people say, I never knew about the Lavender Menace. I didn't even know that Bayard Rustin existed. So many people I see have said that, like, oh my God, what a hero, you know, people, I didn't know there was an uprising at, you know, Cooper's Donuts. All of that stuff is just extraordinarily gratifying.
Yeah, Alex, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit more about the utility of breaking the series up in these episodes, with each episode focusing on a different decade. What do you think that allowed you all and the filmmakers you brought in to do that perhaps, you know, a feature-length film, for example, might not be able to do?
Well, we had trouble getting as much in with just 6 hours. So with the feature, we'd be in real trouble. But I think that the freedom that the directors had, and that was really, I really want to put that on Christine, because she is a, you know, filmmaker first, creative, and it was really like her flying that flag the whole time to make sure that these filmmakers had their unique perspective and lens on the decade. And I think that that's what's so satisfying about the project. Look, you can't put everything into a show, you know. Right. You just can't. There's just not enough time. I mean, hopefully maybe this will go on for like more seasons, and then you can make a more robust attempt at trying to do that. But that wasn't what we knew, that we couldn't do that. So we wanted to work with the tools that we had. And that was looking at the filmmakers and having conversations with them about, you know, what did they want to get across with that decade? And you mentioned the history before Stonewall. And when Andrew Ahn came onto this project, that was one of the most critical things that he wanted to put into his decade. He wanted to make sure that an audience would walk away from watching the 60s, his interpretation, his lens of the 60s, to make sure that people walked away understanding that there was a very robust, intense history that happened before Stonewall, and that it was initiated by people of color and some of the most marginalized, you know, voices within America in that time period, and then within, you know, the queer community. So I really think that you can see each filmmaker's personality kind of come through, and what really resonated with them. Alex and Anthony were our, you know, directing duo from the 1980s, and for them, they really wanted to concentrate on the city of New York, but not just because it's New York. They wanted to show within one island, one small, you know, like piece of America, that you could have so many different scenes going on to show, you know, how how layered, you know, the community was at the time, and how people were dealing with it, the AIDS crisis, and how different people, different genders, different races, different, you know, classes were all impacted by what happened in the 1980s. And so I think that those really big takeaways for each decade, that was a result of the freedom, you know, that the directors had.
Mhm. And I'd say, I think despite each episode having a different director, there is a through line of like energy and purpose and intent between each episode. Christine, could you talk a little bit about like the conversations that you all had with the different directors about what needed to be kind of carried through, if anything?
Well, I think, and just, I just want to add two things to what Alex said, which is, FX was incredibly supportive. Like they kind of let us embark on this pretty big experiment, and one of the things that was also really important to me was that the directors not all be documentary directors, and they're a true mix. Some of them, I would say, Tom and Cheryl and Andrew had probably never really done documentary, or at least not like this, before, ever before. So we're already starting with a big learning curve. But the one thing that was really in everybody's mind was this had to feel very character driven. There had to be a sense of of who these people were and what was at stake for them. And that was something that we tried. I think that's what propels each episode. I love that there's some characters who appear in more than one. That just feels, it does then you start to get a sense of like how the pieces are put together. But it's not a linear history. It's non-linear, and it is messy and complicated. And as Alex says, we probably need another 6 hours.
There's also something like particularly important about like having LGBTQ people who lived through these time periods speaking about their own personal experiences. And I feel like so many other renderings of queer history, a lot of times it's not queer people talking about, what they experienced. It's sometimes comes from like a more academic, perspective. And I love how you all, like you just mentioned, zeroed in on certain characters in different episodes, and folks that like maybe some people don't know about, like Cayenne, for example. Love her. Could y'all talk, I'll come to you, Alex, about, that process of working with the directors, figuring out which voices, what talking heads that you all wanted to incorporate?
Yeah, I mean, that was a Herculean task to figure out, and it really was challenging for the earlier decades. As you get to the 90s, it started to become a little bit easier to identify people that are still with us, and that where we could get enough archival to support, to bring the story to life and all of that. But the process was, for each episode or each decade, was we would map out the kind of tentpole historical moments that, as a starting place. And that was kind of a roadmap that we would have on a big whiteboard. And then we would try to identify like who, what was happening at large within the community, who were the protagonists, who were the antagonists, and we would split up the board, and travel through time and kind of try to trace the, what was happening, for example, like what was happening with the government, against, with legislation and things like that. And so we have that kind of as a thread all the way through. And from that kind of historical, like smorgasbord, and we would have, queer historians come and visit us. That was amazing. And and work with us and provide some of the stories that, you know, that you can't, that are like a lot harder to find. We would start kind of, you know, figuring out like, well, who are the people that we can go to kind of bring that history to life. We're not going to touch everything, but if we were to zoom out, like Christine said, what is the character? Who are the characters that can give us some of that historical sense that lived, you know, through this? And so people started to you know, we had lists of people that we would talk to, you know, and then it was like this challenge of making sure that we weren't hitting kind of like one note all the way through the series. And we wanted it to be as diverse as possible. So we were very careful in making sure that we were hearing from different you know, groups within the queer community as we would go through history. And so it was kind of like looking at it as a big play, you know, for the whole series. And then the directors would, you know, we just found our footing. And, you know, some of our historians that are, you know, serve as talking heads, I hate that word, but that serve as our panelists, or not, I hate that word too, our experts, I don't know, throughout the show, they really became a part of our family, and they would help us find other folks. Felicia Flames, who actually just passed away, which is we're really very, very sad about. We were able to reach out to her because one of our experts had an existing relationship, and Andrew met Felicia, and we flew her to LA and had this magnificent conversation. And, you know, all throughout the show, it was like this reality that I think every filmmaker that weighed on all of us which was that, especially with the 50s and 60s and 70s and even 80s for that matter, the history, the oral history that has been passed down, it was really important for us to capture it. And so sometimes we would interview people just to make sure we got them on film, you know, to be really honest, because this was, to us, it was more than just a show. It was being able to capture these interviews so that it's not lost, you know, so that the oral traditions are not, or the oral history just doesn't evaporate as people, you know, pass on. So I don't know if that, I kind of rambled, but those are some of the strategies and how we kind of dealt with figuring out who we were going to talk to.
Yeah, I love that idea of, you know, sometimes just interviewing people just because we needed to document their existence and their brilliance in this moment for generations to come, because it makes me think of a lot of the archival footage that is incorporated throughout the mini episodes. I particularly loved Nelson Sullivan's videos. You know, we get to see a pre-glam, a pre-Drag Race RuPaul, you know, which I know a lot of the kids don't know about that era of RuPaul. But how did you all kind of go about discovering and gaining access to some of these videos that I've never seen or even knew existed? I'll come to you, Christine, first.
I mean, I think Alex has more of a front row seat to that than I do, but I do just want to say one of the great things, you know, the 80s episode, for example, with Nelson, I believe our directors were probably born in the 80s, you know. Andrew in his 60s episode, he wasn't around in the 60s. So I do think this sort of like juxtaposition of directors who were discovering their own history, you know, and Andrew is a good example, for example, because he was the last director who came on board. And 60s was all that was left. So he's like, yeah, this sounds really interesting. So I'm thinking maybe the decade I'd like. And I'm like, you don't get to choose. So we got the 60s. Yay. So watching that happen, watching like people delve into those decades and that sense of discovery, I think really informs the episodes in a really wonderful way.
Yeah, Alex.
You should talk about, like, you know, getting some of that
archival.
Yeah.
Yeah, archival. I mean, look, when we were able to have access to Nelson Sullivan's archival, I think everybody, it was the greatest gift, you know, that this show could have. His archival was actually, or the relationship there was actually as a result, or a result of Anthony and Alex, who directed that episode. They had ties to the estate, and they knew about it and knew about the archival's existence, you know, way before they were brought onto the show. And they, you know, we went back and forth from like, how do we build Nelson out as a character? Do we just use the archival to paint a picture? And then obviously the answer was like, you have to use Nelson as a character. It's one of my favorite things about the series, because you have this documentation of lives. And I think, you know, another big theme of this show or the series was this balance of joy, but also sadness, joy, but also struggle, right? And, you know, that's the truth of the community. I mean, it's the truth of life, you know, like we all have highs and lows. And I think what Nelson's footage did for that episode is, you know, the episode is probably one of the most discussed and talked about chapters of queer history because of the AIDS crisis and everything that surrounded that. But Anthony and Alex, Christine and myself, like, we all wanted to show the joy. We all wanted to show the life in spite of, right? And I think Nelson's footage really, you get to see it. It's just not even, it's not just mentioned, you know, in passing. You really get to live it. And people, you know, kind of in search of finding themselves. And I think that's, that archival was just so brilliant in that way. Yeah.
One of the I think points that rises for me throughout the entire series is kind of the relationship between the LGBTQ rights movement and the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, the ways in which a lot of that was kind of, you know, inspired and generative between them. Because I often feel like, you know, when those types of relationships are rendered on screen, it's often antagonistic. We don't talk about the ways in which, you know, queer people were inspired by the Black Power movement, and how they, you know, use the foundation that they built for the queer movement's uses, as well as the Black queer people, right, who were in both worlds at the same time. I'd love to hear y'all talk a little bit more about the importance and the utility of making kind of those connections between various social movements, you know, real in the show. Christine?
You know, I think you just kind of nailed it. I mean, I think that what we were trying to do is, you know, well, and it's partly what Alex said as well, like what was happening in each decade, what was happening in the government, what did resistance look like, and how did it manifest itself? And then you could really see the mirrors, you know, of somebody like Bayard Rustin, for example, who had really, you know, he had really focused on that kind of nonviolent civil disobedience that he really learned from Gandhi. And, you know, years later, when I was, you know, a very active member of ACT UP, that's what we were all about. It was all about that, you know, so holding up those mirrors, I think enriched each episode, but also gave you a real sense of how these things just flow into each other.
Yeah, I think that point for me personally, I think that it was a foundation. It was one of the most important foundations of the series, was to give credit to the African-American civil rights movement. And, you know, and to show how much was derived, you know, out of that. You know, I think that there's a lot of parallels that for me and the directors, that we were really interested in exploring, which was, you know, within the Black community, there, I grew up with an understanding of like, oh, there's, our history has like this kind of there's this two-track history of like, do you take a seat at the table or do you flip the table over? And that is like a very, that there's two approaches. And my personal opinion is that you need everyone, right? You need everyone to do everything when you're fighting for your life and fighting for rights. And I think that it was really interesting to dig into the queer civil rights movement because it was the same discussion, and in the 50s, that episode, the official movement was the homophile movement, right? And they were taking a lot from the civil rights movement, the existing civil rights movement that was, starting to gain steam. And in the 60s, the homophile movement continues. But we wanted to show that the homophile movement was very limited, and very, they weren't, it was predominantly white. It was, cisgender women and men. And so while they were adopting tactics that, Black Southerners were actively involved in, it wasn't inclusive. And so we really wanted to kind of show that break, not to necessarily say that, oh, the homophile movement should have never existed, but to show that like for real growth and real change, no one is free until we're all free, right? So that was another really big theme that I think exists within Black, for our culture. And I also believe it exists within queer culture. And so we wanted to, in every episode, braid those things together. And I think the director I think Yancey Ford, I think his episode really kind of shows you how these, like it's this climatic moment where all these worlds are trying to exist and have space. And it's like, well, what is going to happen? And as we were making this episode or the series, this last summer happened, and everything it exploded. And while it was an explosion for some, for many people, it was like, oh, this is our, this is business as usual. This is our real life, right? And I think even for us on this film, we were having all these dialogues with the network and amongst ourselves of, we all really wanted to give voice, and we wanted to really let the Black trans community have the last word in this show. I mean, that was really important because we felt that the trans community at large, has had such a tough time taking center stage, and the Black trans community in particular, based on what this country went through last summer, it was important to remember that all Black lives matter. And so we really took that very seriously. And Ro Haber, who directed the 2000s up to kind of present day, we tried to build that into the episode, and it's a continuation. It's not over, right? So that was another thing. It's like there's still so much more to do, but the only way that you can move forward is you really have to understand, the mistakes, the failures, and the successes of what a movement has done. And we tried to do that within 6 hours, within the time that we had to work on it. So
I'd love to know, you speaking brought up a number of questions for me, but I want to first start with, in what ways was, the production of the series impacted by, the last year, whether that's kind of the socio-political reckoning, or by obviously the pandemic. Like, how did you all go about navigating that?
Alex, I'm trying to remember. I know we were pretty far along and really entering post when the pandemic happened. And so a lot of the decisions we had to make were less about production than they were about post-production, although we did a tiny bit more shooting.
Yes, we did a tiny bit more shooting. I think we were already on this path that I mentioned before, before the horrible killings that happened last summer. However, the march in Brooklyn for Black trans lives had not happened. And
That's right.
when that happened, every director that lived in New York went, everyone who worked on this show who lived in New York was there. Cayenne was there. And it was a painful and beautiful thing. It's this mix of a situation to have trailed Cayenne for a year leading up to that, essentially, and to know her story, and then to see this moment where, because we were going to marches with Cayenne, I think we filmed one at Washington Square Park, and there were people in attendance, but it was not what happened in Brooklyn last summer. And to see thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people show up for Black trans lives was very moving. And I think it was, it felt like, when you're making a documentary, every now and then you get those moments where it feels like, oh, all of this going up the mountain and going up the hill, to try to tell this story. And then, oh my God, the world gets it. For this moment, the world gets it. And that's what that felt like. And so that was a really special moment that we were able to film. And it was really exciting to share with the FX and to help them even understand how, what our messaging was and why these themes and these characters and someone like Cayenne is so critical to put front and center for a series like this.
Christine, I'd love to hear from you about, one thing I'm always interested in, particularly when it comes to historical type works of our history as a community, is how you all's approach is informed by kind of this moment of increased LGBTQ visibility that we are in right now. Does it change? I was thinking a lot about the illustrations, animated parts of some of the episodes. And for me, I was like, oh, this takes something that could be seen as boring, to a certain type of audience, and it animates it and it activates it in a particular way that might make it more resonant to them. Just wondering if you all had conversations or thoughts about the audience that you all were doing this work for.
I mean, always. I think that it kind of goes back to, since each episode was kind of starting all over again, because each director had their own personal perspective on the story they wanted to tell and the way they wanted to tell it. I mean, for example, if you're familiar with Cheryl Dunye's work at all, she puts herself in her films frequently, and that was something she really wanted to do in her episode, to help bring herself and her particular way of storytelling directly into her show. And I think I think the discussion of who is this for, it was, obviously we wanted the answer to be for everybody, but we also wanted to really find ways to pull an audience in. And each director did that in a different way. Tom Kalin, of course, with his reenactments, which I think are absolutely beautifully done. But no, that's it. There's no other reenactments for the rest of the series. The animation that Andrew uses doesn't come back either. They each of them, and the ways in which Yancey brings alive the culture wars, in my opinion, is highly original, and also was something absolutely specific to him. So I think it's sort of in that way we try to create that kind of personal filmmaking that has that kind of resonance across every kind of line.
That makes me think of, the fact that when folks watch this conversation, it will be in the middle of Pride Month. And while we are still, figuring out what this pandemic looks like, I'd love for our last question just to be about, what you all hope people are taking away from, the viewing experience of these 6 episodes. What do you think is, or maybe for you, let's personalize it. And I'll start with you, Christine. What do you take away from this entire experience and detailing this history that you think is instructive for audiences?
I mean, look, this was a long haul, and I'm sure Alex can point to some wrinkles and say, I call this one episode 2, I call this one episode 6. It was really challenging. And when I read the first review that I read of the show, that was very positive. Not only was it very positive, it understood what we were trying to do. And because there's always those moments when you're doing something like this where you're just like, are we crazy? Should we have just gotten one person to just do this and we'd be done already? This would have showed last Pride, and then, we wouldn't be like tearing our hair out, So I guess what I really want people to take away, is a sort of more nuanced sense of, what our community is and what it can be, and how it simply isn't just one thing. And I think if that happens, we're a success.
I love that. Alex?
I don't know how to follow up with Christine, but I think that I think 2 things. I hope that people understand that, or I hope that this is I hope this is the first of many more to come. I hope that we see a lot more documentaries, films, just stories being told that from the queer community and all of these people who walked this earth, and lived in this country specifically, that are their history is American history. It is our history, and it is our collective history. And I hope that the audience I hope that, some people watch this and they can feel a sense of a shared, a community, a shared sense of pride, of how to move forward, and can relate to some of these characters, especially those that are no longer with us. But I also hope that people who are not within the queer, sorry, let me say that again. I also hope people that are not in the queer community can look at this and recognize it as being American history and a part of their history too. So, and I hope that it inspires the teenage filmmaker out there to go and run and find more stories, because we need to put the history down. We need to document it. Yeah.
I love that. Well, thank you, Alex and Christine, for joining us today. Thank you, Andrea, our ASL interpreter, for your brilliance. And thanks to everyone out there for watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.